All right, greetings, Herle Burly-ites. Whether you've been with this podcast for a few years now or a few weeks, you know we do our best to get past the talking points of politics and campaigning, economics and public policy, and give you a perspective on what's really going on. Not just in the official meetings that take place in Ottawa and so many other boardrooms around the country, but in the meeting after the meeting. We're aided greatly with that agenda by the guests we bring in here weekly, and today's guest is a guy that's been in a hell of a lot of those meetings after the meeting. Brian Topp is here. Brian is one of the country's foremost political strategists. He's a sought-after writer, communications planner, and a former union leader. In 2015, he was Chief of Staff to Alberta Premier Rachel Notley, and prior to that, Deputy Chief of Staff to Roy Romanow in Saskatchewan. In 2006 and 2008, Brian was the Federal New Democratic Party's National Campaign Director. And following the death of Jack Layton in 2012, he ran for the party leadership, coming in second to Tom Mulcair. Currently, Brian is a founding partner at GT&Co. Today, we're going to tour the horizon of Canadian politics, check in on all the parties and how they're doing, what's the state of our politics, and how are politicians reacting to the mood of the country and changing political coalitions and alliances. I can't think of anybody better to talk about that with. Brian is, in my view, one of the smartest and most interesting political minds in the country, and I'm just delighted to have him here. Thank you, Brian, very much for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here. I'm sorry I don't have as interesting a T-shirt as Mike McDonald had a few shows ago, but hey,
I know,
who can beat that?
Who can beat that? I got to get out to Calgary and get myself one of those. I have to settle today for a Beach Boys T-shirt because it is August, after all.
It is August.
Yeah. How are you, Brian?
I'm okay. Sunburnt, but otherwise good.
Why are you sunburnt? What have you been doing? Where are you?
I am currently in Toronto, just back from a cottage outside of Haliburton, where we spent too much time on a river on floaties. And that just tells you that it's August.
Nice. I was on a floaty on a river. I was telling you just before the show started, and it deflated. It deflated in the middle of the river, and I was only glad, since I can't swim, that it was a river, not a lake. I could just take the thing and stand up. You actually made it to the end of the river.
I did. But, we've all been there in politics, brother.
Well, let's get into politics. I would like to start by getting your take on the Trudeau government. What impresses you and disappoints you about the government?
I'll start by saying, and I say this in part because I worked with them pretty closely when I was in Alberta for a while, that this prime minister can surprise you, given his political kind of his look, the way he presented himself to the public. He is somebody who was capable of reaching into the big head full of hair, finding the zipper, pulling it down. His dad steps out. He makes a tough, clear decision based on what he thinks is the national interest, and then he goes back into the suit and goes back to being the guy with the socks. And so he has had the advantage of all great prime ministers, I think, of being underestimated, and he is surprisingly clear-eyed and tough, which is what you need in a prime minister. And they've done some good stuff, I can say, across the fence. I think this government is going to be remembered in history for the first federal government that really acted decisively on climate change, and it was a long time coming. I think another thing to say about this government is that it has been terribly distracted by issues beyond its control. The Trump administration confronted it with a first-class economic potential crisis in the reopening of NAFTA, and to Deputy Prime Minister Freeland's credit, I think they stick-handled that one pretty well, and it took a lot of their time. And then just when they were coming up out of that, here we go on COVID, which, required a massive public expenditure and a tremendous distraction. And so now what remains to be seen is this. So they got one big thing done, then they had two big oh, by the way, and then Ukraine, which has been eating a lot of their time, so let's call it three. Do they have anything else? In the circumstance in which the public cares about the cost of living, about inflation, economic concerns, housing are top of mind issues, and you have a dangerous populist alternative on the right, fueled by the anti-vax movement. Have they got anything left? We'll see.
What do you think is a useful political response to inflation?
I don't know. I don't know, but I think what we know that is on offer from the alternative is angry populism, and so somebody better think of something smart pretty damn fast, because otherwise it is a perfect pocketbook issue for the right.
How do you feel? Given that, Poilievre is going to win the Conservative leadership. He's going to be the leader of the party. How do you think that Trudeau is positioned for a fight against Poilievre?
Let's start by saying this. I think what we see is that the barbaric cultural practices campaign and the 1-800-SNITCH line campaign that Mr. Harper ran on in 2015 was not an aberration. It was a throat clearing. And and that is what they have decided to be. And so they have been looking around for a better horse to ride other than, vilifying New Canadians, which for quite a while they were trying to work up as their base. You could say it was maybe tactically okay with some of their members, but strategically very foolish. And they have found a new horse to ride, and the horse that they have ride is the Freedom Convoy and the anti-vax folks in Canada. And they're basically adopting their rhetoric and trying to write it into the government of Canada. And then they're bundling up a bunch of real pocketbook concerns, the inaccessibility of housing, the fact that ordinary people haven't really had a pay increase for many, many years, and they're now seeing their current earnings eroded by a scary pop in inflation. And they're bundling this all up very effectively in some very well-polished, angry right-wing rhetoric, a lot of it borrowed from some of the crazier folks in the U.S. Republican Party. And they are a formidable challenge, especially in the circumstance in which the government is getting long in the tooth. And so there's a tactical question, which is what's the current government going to do? And then there's an interesting strategic question that progressives face all around the democratic world, which is what is the answer from progressives to angry right-wing, in many cases, pretty ugly right-wing populism? I think the person who has come the closest to answering this is the current Chancellor of Germany and the German SDP, who resisted the temptation that, for example, the Danish Social Democrats went through to just adopt your opponent's platform. So in Denmark, the Social Democrats got back in power by running on an anti-immigrant campaign. I don't think there's a place for that in Canada outside of the Conservative Party. So what Mr. Stoltz did was he found a very simple message. He said, it's time we had a country in which you, working class people, ordinary working families, are respected again. And then we need to talk about, as a practical matter, what does that look like? That it means that you're paid properly, that you get a pay increase that for the first time in a long time, and that you can afford your home. And I think that was smart, because it wasn't, what we in the NDP like to do in our current model of campaigning, which is, here's our 10 proposals, and they add up to $1 trillion. Is that awesome or what? And instead, what he was doing was campaigning on an emotional connection with workers. He was saying that and ordinary people, that you feel disrespected in your own country, and it is time for that to change. I think that is the closest anybody in the progressive left has come to answering this right-wing populism that we see being seeded in Canada in the official opposition. And we need to be that smart, or those people are going to win, and that will be a dark day for Canada.
We went through the neoliberalism period, which took over all of our parties in Canada, and to the point where the NDP considered it necessary to commit to balanced budgets in election platforms, and you governed through it with Romanow in Saskatchewan. Now that it's over, and it clearly appears that everybody thinks neoliberalism is a failed ideology, does the left know what's next? Like, is there an idea out there about what government should be doing? Or I'm following up on your point about the German chancellor and whether we've stopped being ambitious in that way on the left side of the spectrum for so long that we don't know how to do it anymore.
Well, we're all pilgrims searching. And I don't think anybody has the answers, but I think we can certainly see the problem, and that is that the public is not satisfied with process, and they're not satisfied with words, and what they are doing is thinking about their own lives. And when you take to be in the recent frame of Canada, with the way the current government campaigned, if you think of the quote unquote middle class in Canada, what's on their minds? What's on their minds is having a heck of a hard time remaining in the middle class and having a very hard time imagining how their children are going to do better than they did. And when that's where the public is at, then they are going to try to use the agency that they have to try to change it. And the key agency that they have is their vote. And when you are being offered simple, angry solutions from the right that are about making you angry and about saying that your problems are because of that bad person over there, and then we kick them, that everything's going to be okay, right? That if you don't offer a better alternative than that, then maybe people will give it a try, because at least the right is talking about what's on people's minds. And so I think where it starts with is that people on the progressive left need to listen to their own folks and the people that they aspire to represent, and then speak to their issues in ways that make sense to them. And the New Democrats have basically been running the same campaign for the last 30 years. And so whenever we are and wherever we are, we always have the same solution, which is here's our 10 spending proposals from today's NDP. And that's not cutting it with working people. And so you need to ask yourself, what does? And none of us have the answers. It's like the film business, nobody knows what works, or otherwise everybody in the film business would be millionaires. But you got to keep trying, and you got to start by looking at yourself and going, why aren't we doing better? And then try to do better.
But one of the things people want, Brian, is tax cuts when they're in a situation like this, right? They want to pay less in taxes. And the problem is, if you're a progressive, you don't want to gut the tax base of the government any further than it already is. I mean, the ability of the state has been significantly constrained by tax cuts throughout what I described as the neoliberal era of the 90s and 2000s already.
I think people know that a lot of the tax cut populism is false economies. If we pretend to give you a tax cut and then you're on your own on your health care, didn't make your family go better. And so I think fundamentally Canadians know that this is a con, but they also know that in the last 30 or 40 years or so, that there's been one of the biggest transfers of wealth from lower and middle class people to rich people that's happened in history. And that we are basically back to the Gilded Era in terms of distribution of wealth. And so I think people are a little more sophisticated than that. And they know that the country hasn't been governed in their interests for a long time, and that the people who have been governing it have looked after themselves. And they want that to change. And when the progressive left, which unfortunately has in part been complicit in these events, doesn't speak to that, then you leave the terrain for the right. And look, we just had an election in Ontario where a very canny conservative premier spoke directly to working class people on some of these issues and said, I care about you and I'm going to do something about it. And they didn't hear Mr. Ford's opposition say that in a way that caused them to change their vote. Right? And so this is a clear sign that if we don't talk to these issues, the other side will. In fact, they're already doing so.
Right. All right. Before we leave the Liberals politically, I know that, one of the things that makes you so interesting is that even though you're an NDP strategist, you are a student of the Liberal Party. What's your take on the future of the Liberal Party post Justin Trudeau?
Well, look, having given it a shot for 35 years or so, I could say that the Liberal Party is a pretty formidable opponent, especially on the federal level, and has a lot to be proud of in its record and isn't going anywhere. I think when we want to talk about the prospects for parties, I think we begin by saying that Canada is in good part governed by provinces. And the provincial level is much more hopeful for the Democrats in terms of getting to office in the near term. So we are in office in British Columbia, just undergoing a leadership change there, but a pretty neat government that is still looks pretty fresh and able. I think Rachel Notley has a decent shot, although there are no entitlements in politics to be reelected in Alberta. I think Bob Canoe has a great shot, although again, there's no entitlements in Manitoba. And then I think we have an opportunity to get Saskatchewan surrounded and to do something about a Tory government in Saskatchewan that is very long in the tooth indeed. And the New Democrats were able to hold on to official opposition status in Ontario. That gives them their shot at office in 3.5 years or so. And so, provincially, I just by talking with the Orange team, I think they've got some nice opportunities provincially. And my point is, those opportunities aren't necessarily there for the Red team if something doesn't change. Okay, so then you're into the 7th year of the Trudeau government in federally. That third term, I can tell you, and you know this too, it's just pretty tough to get that third term. You can do it, but it gets tough, right? And so at some point, the Liberal Party federally is going to end up back in opposition, just in the clock spins of politics. And, traditionally, when parties get whumped federally, you go back to your provincial redoubts and you regenerate there, and that's where you go. So I think the challenge for the Red team is that they need to find some success provincially, because at some point they're going to run out of success federally. Now, that said, another way to look at federal politics in the Liberal Party federally is that it could be that the Conservatives are making a suicidal play in embracing the freedom convoy and the anti-vaxxers, and that political alternative is going to be rejected by the overwhelming majority of Canadians if they hear something better. And that is a sterling opportunity for the Trudeau Liberals to regenerate themselves, to come up with a new agenda, to have 2 or 3 compelling new things to say, and to earn themselves another term, either under the current Prime Minister or somebody like the Deputy Prime Minister. And if that happens, then we in the opposition benches will continue to be annoyed about federal politics, but that's their opportunity. It could be that the official opposition is in the middle of committing suicide.
Right. We'll get to that in a few minutes. I think we'll have fun talking about that. Scrutiny, evidence, measurement of the things we do to make sure the things we do actually work. Herle Burly-ites, don't these concepts apply to, just about everything we need to operate smoothly in our lives? And lately, you may have noticed a lot of media attention, government scrutiny, and dinner table conversations combing through the evidence and best practices about how telecommunications networks are built and how they operate in Canada. On behalf of our presenting sponsor, TELUS, I'm here to tell you that evidence-based decision-making, deep dives into best practices, and high levels of scrutiny also need to be present in how we divvy up and deploy spectrum in this country. Without spectrum, those invisible data-carrying radio waves that make your smartphone smart, networks do not run. Spectrum is fundamental to how all of us thrive, whether we live in big cities or rural communities. And yet, today, we don't take full advantage of the policy tools and the evidence to make sure we're getting these policies right. Sounds shocking, I know, but we don't sufficiently measure the progress, impact, or successes of our spectrum policies. So, here are 2 ways forward from TELUS. Before any policy decision is made, all spectrum consultation should include a rigorous economic analysis carried out by an independent third party, so decision makers, stakeholders, and all Canadians can accurately assess its broader impacts. Following a policy decision, a performance measurement framework should be administered by Statistics Canada, updated every 2 years, with an additional substantive report on policy impacts 5 years after each spectrum auction. It's a constantly evolving wireless world, Herle Burly-ites. Flawless connectivity is ever more crucial to our economy, our healthcare, our education, our climate, everything. You may never think about the details of spectrum, but you feel it in your everyday. We'll continue this story next week. You mentioned the provinces. So, what is the difference between John Horgan, NDP, and Jagmeet Singh, NDP?
I think they get along pretty well.
No, not personally, but just in terms of political approach. What is the difference that makes way more British Columbians want to vote for the provincial party than the federal party, for example?
Well, the BC NDP doesn't have to worry about Ontario, and in particular about the GTA, where the Liberal brand is incredibly strong, especially at the federal level, and where voters think that politics is federal and don't follow provincial politics, as you know very well. And
Yes.
and that in the consequence, you don't start 10 yards behind in a 100-yard dash. I mean, the way politics have shaken down in British Columbia is into classic Western Canadian play out between a very conservative party, so-called BC Liberals, who may well rename themselves fairly soon, which would be appropriate, and the broad mass of progressive and moderate voters who have gathered behind Premier Horgan. That's a much, much better environment for John Horgan than Jagmeet Singh faces. Jagmeet Singh is is David taking on Goliath. He's taking on the Liberal Party of Canada and its current fortress, the federal government. That's really tough. And another piece of the puzzle for Jagmeet is that I think he is back to where every NDP leader was, other than Jack Layton, which is that he hasn't figured out the puzzle of Quebec yet. And there's no victory for the federal NDP that does not go through Quebec. Right.
But let me just come back to this, because I talked to Mike McDonald a little bit about it, and I've talked with some other people about it. I think both the federal NDP and the federal Liberals are having trouble connecting to working class voters. So my question is, what does Horgan do to get a sawmill worker to vote for him that Singh can't do to get a sawmill worker to vote for him?
Well, I mean, Singh has gotten the sawmill workers to vote for him in BC, but he has, I think he confronted a more formidable opponent in Eastern Canada. And as I just said, he didn't solve the puzzle that is Quebec. And so he has to play with the cards he's dealt on the chessboard he's in. British Columbia politics is a straightforward matter, as Mike was saying in your interview with him. BC politics is basically about a debate about what you think about resource development versus where you stand on the environment. And if you can balance those issues, you can get, 55 to 60% of British Columbians to say, whether or not I vote for you, you're doing what I want, which is what Premier Horgan has done. Federal scene is infinitely more complicated. And, I think to give Jagmeet his due, he has survived in a circumstance in which you can't take that for granted at the federal level. I can tell you this, having been national campaign director for the NDP a couple of times. The first question that every national campaign director faces working for the NDP is, are we going to survive? Can we re-elect the caucus and keep party status, right? And then after that, you're playing for points. It's a much, much tougher chess puzzle. In 3D, it's 13 jurisdictions, 2 languages plus many new ones. It is just a completely different proposition.
My impression is that Singh and the NDP have largely in recent months disappeared from the federal discourse in any important way. Now, that could be that Poilievre is sucking up all the oxygen, but I also think that the supply and confidence agreement has somewhat neutered the NDP's ability to full-throatedly differentiate themselves from the government. What do you think?
Well, I think that you're right, that the federal NDP has been pretty low profile lately. Let's talk about it. It's an interesting little chess puzzle with federal minority parliament. NDP voters don't like angry right-wing populism at all. And they have different expectations of their party. And those expectations are rooted in the proudest moment that everybody thinks of in the Orange team. And that is the way that Tommy Douglas maneuvered in minority parliament in partnership with Lester Pearson to bring Canada Medicare. They like angry campaigning as much as any other partisan does. They like seeing a strong campaign and going for broke. But in a minority parliament, their expectation is not that the party is going to join the Tories in a full-throated attempt to kill the government and to force another election. That's not what they're looking for. What they're looking for is...
Funny, that's just how I recall it.
I don't like that. We can talk about why that is. I had something to do with that. Look, if you are given power in a minority parliament, you're in a balance of power position. What the members are expecting is that you're going to try to do something with it. Okay, in a circumstance in which the NDP has never won an election federally, getting the balance of power in a minority parliament is as close as they've gotten so far to power. And so why would you throw that away when instead, and people from labor backgrounds will have this on their minds, of course, you finally have some leverage in a bargaining position, why don't you try to get something for it?
Right.
So, and in those circumstances, you're in the problem of being the minority partner in a minority parliament in which you are the agent that makes good things happen and the government gets the credit for it. And what do you do about that? Now, there's a lively debate about what to do about this. And one of them is, you can't just cut a deal at the beginning of such a parliament and then go to sleep. You have to create regular periods where you're relevant, right? And you need to be sure that the public sees what you're doing. But objectively, in many parliaments, that almost inevitable consequence of choosing to do this is that you're rewarded for your good works by being kicked in the head and following the election. And you know what? I think that's okay. I think in the grand scheme of things, it's okay to accept a rough election if you made some progress, because in the long game, you'll always be able to point to it as why people should vote for you. And that's what New Democrat voters expect of their federal party. Although what they dearly wish for is that it would actually win.
Right.
And so, the puzzle of how to actually win, that's where I say, victory for the federal NDP lies through Quebec. But while you are trying to figure that one out, if you have a balance of power in minority parliament, you should use it. And then the problem is what you're raising, which is, and in consequence, especially, how shall I put this gently, a media environment that would tend to be more interested in what the official opposition is doing. It's tempting to say, your good works are not newsworthy. Plane lands safely is not an exciting story. Reasonable parties in parliament work out a court. It's not going to fuel political coverage for 4 years. What fuels coverage is conflict and anger. And that plays to an angry opposition party. But that's not what members expect from the NDP. And so they have a harder road to hoe. But you know what? At the end of the day, I think pursuing this road by our lights means you're going to be prouder of the work you did.
Right. So last year was just lousy for Canada's grain farmers. Annus horribilis, as the Queen would say. The first drought in 20 years reduced the crop by nearly 40%, tens of millions of tons. At the same time, extreme heat and fires last summer in British Columbia delivered a shocking blow to rail service. Something called an atmospheric river then followed up, washing out railroad tracks in BC and at one point effectively turning the lower mainland into an island. After all that came one of the most severe winters we've ever experienced, during which Russia invaded Ukraine, another giant grain producer, disrupting markets worldwide. Like I said, lousy. Now, the industry is looking forward to a new crop. So is our sponsor, CN, which happens to be the biggest single mover of Canadian grain. Every year, the railway produces an official grain plan. This year's just came out. CN is forecasting a rebound, and the railway has spent a lot of money in the past year to prepare for it. It's bought new locomotives and added to its fleet of high-efficiency, high-capacity hopper cars, and spent hundreds of millions upgrading its tracks and bridges and crossings. So CN is as ready as it can possibly be for the new grain crop, within human limits. Plainly, the climate is changing, producing events that cannot be overcome. There's a reason for the term force of nature. That said, the railway is suggesting that one way to cope with the risk of extreme weather is to spread out shipments, send grain west and east. Right now, the industry ships most of its grain to ports on the west coast, creating the vulnerability we witnessed last year, when most of the extreme weather was in British Columbia. Meanwhile, eastern ports like Thunder Bay, Montreal, and Quebec City all have capacity to handle more grain efficiently. It only makes sense that we take advantage of them. With the situation in Ukraine, Canada's farmers are more than ever responsible for feeding the world, and CN wants to move the new crop as efficiently as possible, which might mean working around extreme weather rather than trying to work through it. Is there a brand problem with the NDP? I mean, this would seem to be a long-in-the-tooth government that polling is showing there's real dissatisfaction with, and a cost of living crisis that's really affecting low and middle-income people, would seem to be a very good opportunity for the NDP to be making gains at the expense of the Liberals. We don't really see that in public opinion. The NDP in Ontario had 2 consecutive pretty good shots at winning elections against what could hardly be described as a juggernaut from the Conservative side, and weren't able to do so. Now, Quebec, let's just leave Quebec aside and talk about Ontario. What is the NDP's brand problem, if it is such a thing, in Ontario?
Yeah, well, I'll begin by saying, look, I don't mind how the brand's doing in a lot of provinces at the moment. Okay? So we'll see how bad the brand problem is in the next 2 to 3 years as these provincial elections play out.
Fair enough.
So then you're talking about 2 separate issues: the federal.
I mean, like in 2018, which I was following pretty closely. In 2018, I really thought about 2/3 of the way through that the NDP were going to win the election. I really believed that. And then people recoiled. Why did they recoil?
Yeah, well, I watched that one pretty closely too. I was the transition chair for Andrea Horwath in that campaign. And so I was working away quietly, asking the question, if we won, what would we do?
Right.
And, it was an interesting experience, David, because for a period of about 2 weeks there, I had more friends than I'd ever known. It was amazing.
The people that wanted to contribute to your policy process are amazing.
I'm not saying that. I just personal friends, close personal friends that I didn't know that I had. Had a few helpful ideas. I just say, very, very interesting process. And then about
well, I'm no hypocrite. I was still cursing you.
So and then about E-8, maybe something like that. It just all went silent. Suddenly, I didn't have all those friends. I was hurt.
Yeah, I know.
And so all this to say, everybody thought that we were going to win that election, and then everybody saw that we weren't. And look, that was. Let me put it this way, and I'm saying this at the risk of making myself a little unpopular with my tribe, but this is something that I said during a big postmortem that was just conducted in Saskatchewan after a series of losses. I'm sick of excuses, okay? And I have led failed campaigns, and in my view, what happens when you lead a failed campaign is you try to learn from it. You say, what happened here that we can learn from, and we could do better next time, right? And I'm sick of postmortems to say, well, we worked really hard and we all did our work well, and we're proud of our work and stuff like that. And no, it's like what you owe the public is shooting to win, and if you don't win, then you should study it. And so in that campaign, we were in a position to win. I think if it had continued the way it was going, we were going to win. Everybody expected that. Premier Ford, Mr. Ford, soon to be Premier, turned on the NDP and he said, if you vote for the NDP, the economy will collapse. And Premier Wynne, God bless her soul, a good friend of Rachel Notley's, and we worked with closely on many files, felt that she needed to say on somebody's advice, if you vote for the NDP, the unions will run the province. And these, of course, are the two of the key weaknesses of the brand that you're pointing to in Ontario. People are worried that the economy will be hurt if they're elected, and they are vulnerable to the charge that they're in, that they are in cahoots with the labor movement, which to my mind is no bad thing, but has been framed for a bunch of reasons we can talk about as not a good thing. Okay, so what did we do? In my view, this is opportunity. So Mr. Ford attacks the party on the theme, you're going to wreck the economy. Premier Wynne attacks her own supporters, many of her own supporters, the labor movement, by saying that the labor movement is going to control the party. And this is opportunity. Okay, the opportunity is the other two parties have stopped.
Never go down without throwing your last rock, for Christ's sake, Brian.
Oh, I totally get it. I'm not being critical. I know I've been there too. But my point is, your opponents have stopped campaigning and they're talking about you. Okay, that's an opportunity. Okay, there's a golden opportunity to talk about the two principal concerns that voters have about you. Your opponents have just invited you to deal with the things that they're worried about before they vote for you. And what did we do? So what we did was we toured around in Southwest Ontario, making small ball announcements to the end. Okay? In other words, we just simply missed the opportunity. And it was a campaign mistake, a collective mistake. I'm not fingering anybody. It was a mistake. Okay. And the result was that we got official party status, which was nice, but missed the golden opportunity to be in office. And a learning organization that is trying to do better would look at that and go, what we need to learn from this is when the campaign's about us, that's an opportunity. And that means we change our campaign and we take advantage of the opportunity. That's the story. Okay. Now, the thing about this was the brand had weaknesses, but she was on the cusp of winning. Okay. And so what that tells you is it's not that bad, the brand, okay? It can be okay. Every election is a new opportunity. Every election is a restart. And this is true for all parties. And so it can be done. And that is also true in the federal level, all right? So yes, the brand has issues at the federal level, but I'm going to stick to my song here that they are, because at the end of the day, although the NDP is a pretty good brand in Western Canada, it still needs to be proved in Central Canada, which is where a whack of the seats are. Until you figure that out, you don't have a shot. And progressive voters start on a Maslowian ladder. And the first rung in the ladder is we don't want a conservative government. And in particular, they are not going to want an angry right-wing progressive populist government. And so that being where they come from, if you don't look like you can win, then you won't. That was the magic of the 2011 election, that Jack Layton was able to make a successful appeal to Quebecers to set aside the empty chairs that they were electing in the Bloc Québécois. And when that happened, then you could see the dominoes starting to fall in the rest of the country as other people said, okay, you're a runner, maybe we'll give you a shot.
Okay, so Layton, you're from Quebec, right?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay. So Layton's an exception to what I'm going to say. But in general terms, absent magic show like he put on in 2011, you can't win seats in Quebec in large numbers without a Francophone leader, correct?
Not correct.
If you're running against Francophones, who's done it?
Well, the person, I guess from memory, the person who came closest was Pearson, of course, who split it.
Not running against a Francophone.
No, you make a good point. What's your point?
My point is that the NDP probably, if they're going to crack Quebec, need to start choosing Quebec leaders. I mean, even in the Liberal Party, we're supposed to be strong in Quebec. We're not strong in Quebec when we have an Anglophone leader. Never have been. Right?
An interesting point. Well, I'm going to point to, now, it's a bit of a mixed story. I mean, Jack sounded like a Francophone. In fact, not only did he sound like a Francophone, but he had a working class French accent that made everybody think of their favorite uncle, right? And he kind of looked like your favorite uncle too. But he was an Anglo. And he did okay, right? So it can be done. But I think at the end of the day, certainly in the progressive space, the issue is not just this. Leadership is an issue for sure. But it is about, you need to make a successful appeal to Quebecers saying, there's something that we can do together, okay? That English-speaking progressives and French-speaking Quebecers can do together. There's issues that we can agree on, that we can work together. And I think the mood in the province is to look for that. But if you don't credibly offer it, then they will go to the old shoes. And if you look at generational opinion, you can see that the younger people are in Quebec, the less interested they are in the old shoes in Quebec, the more open they are to the world, the more interested they are in issues that you can come together on, like the environment, like job creation, like access to housing. And so there
must be a massive schism between Montreal and the rest of Quebec right now.
That's certainly what the map would suggest, yeah.
Right? And the provincial government seems to be dividing the province almost along those lines.
That's true.
So,
old story, running against La Métropole, right? It happens all over the place. Let's send London a message. let's send Paris a message. This is an old story. It is always, and this is, the challenge of progressives versus conservatives, although progressives can be negative too, and you need to be. In a way, conservatives have it easier because their voters are motivated by anger. Progressive voters are looking to build something.
Well, let's move to that then. Poilievre is going to be a big figure in Canadian politics. What does he have going on right now? Are you impressed?
I'm impressed by his tradecraft. And of course, he's getting some excellent advice in putting it together. But this is somebody who's been a politician all his life. He has never done anything else. And so he's pretty good at it. He's got a good voice and he presents himself well. It's not a public speaking style, especially some of his parliamentary performances. It speaks to me, but I'm not his target demographic. You can clearly see that what he has put together really sells with the voters that he's going after, which is the current membership of the Conservative Party and the sort of populist constituency that is growing out there that we've been talking about during this interview. So he's very, very good at what he does. What remains to be seen is, does that sell outside of his world?
So my gut tells me that it doesn't. My experience in Canadian politics tells me that he's on a suicide mission, that he's completely abandoned the center and moderate Canadians, and he's leaving vast amounts of space for the Liberal Party to suck up in an election without much effort at the center of the spectrum, and appealing to something that feels big and strong, but is actually pretty limited in its appeal. That's what my experience tells me. But I also think that he's a smart guy who's experienced in politics and has been in politics his whole life. I think Jenny knows what she's doing in politics. So part of me wonders whether I'm wrong and whether I'm out of touch and whether there's going to be more appetite for what he's selling than I think that there is, and historically certainly than there would be. But when I watched him marching with that guy from the convoy, I don't remember the guy's name, but it wasn't even a meeting, which would have been controversial enough in itself. They were walking together. I said, well, this is just not something that you would do normally, right? This doesn't make any sense by a normal political calculus. So they're doing something else. And that worries me.
Yeah, he was marching with James Topp, who I think is a distant relative. I got raved a little bit about that one. Well, look, other than the bit about the Liberal spectrum, up your lips to God's ear, I hope you're right. I too think that this is essentially not Canadian. This is not who we are. And I think there is a direct line between Harper's last campaign and this, which is not only in terms of who his author is, but also that it's based on an assessment of the people of Canada that I hope and believe is wrong. I don't think this is us. But here's the thing. They'll win the hockey game if they're the only team on the ice. If they're the only alternative out there, then they'll win. And you're counting on the Liberals to knock them out, quote unquote, easily in a circumstance in which they're going for a third term, which is tough to do. It remains to be seen what it's going to take to put them under, but they must be put under. This cannot be what we are. And I don't think most Canadians will see themselves in it, but they're going to be looking to the rest of the political world to make them a better offer. And if they don't, then I think there might well be 35, 36, 37% of the vote out there that's prepared to take a flyer on it. And as we know from Mr. Harper, if he gets the perfect split, you could be the government with that number. And
right.
I think one of the important things for other parties to say to each other and to the public is this time they don't get to govern if they don't have a majority. That a party that is trying to bring that kind of populism to Canada does not get we're gonna be busy with our leadership campaign, so we'll let you govern for a while till the universe comes back to the way it should be. That can't be what other parties say, because this right-wing populism, well put together by a smart leader, which this one is too dangerous to play political games with. They should be stopped.
So what's the way to defeat him?
Well, as I said, we're all pilgrims, and I don't know, right?
Come on, you do know. What would you do?
I start with what's worked. So what's worked is looking for to make emotional connections and values connections with voters instead of offering them laundry lists of stuff to vote for. So New Democrats have to learn that, how to make appeals to voters that aren't just lists of things you're going to spend money on. And so I start with that. I start by asking ourselves, how does it look? Then I think you need to be confronted with the consequences of what they're proposing. Are you seriously proposing that all governments in Canada be barred from public health measures? Is that really what you're saying? And you're saying that the healthcare system should be reserved for people who refuse to get inoculations, and that people who have cancer and heart disease and multiple sclerosis wait in the back of the line while ERs are full of people who refuse to take their medicine. Is that really what you're saying? And then explore the rest of what they're saying. So in other words, they need to be disqualified. They need to be confronted hard on what they're really proposing, get around the honeyed phrases. Oh, we all have to be united. We can't be divided anymore. Break that and talk about what they're really talking about. And I'm hopeful that a majority of the public is going to say, this is not what I want governing the country. And then you need to make a better alternative. Okay. And that is a challenge to the Liberals, and it's a challenge to the Democrats, which is if you got something better to offer. And if it's just good public administration, and we got to get this deficit down, so we're all going to have to tighten our belts for a little while. And I have some very important meetings to go to in New York and Washington and Lausanne. If that's what's on offer, then the people who are talking to the pocketbook issues are going to win.
We'll be back in a minute after a message from our sponsor, Google.
How will inflation affect my kids?
What are the best road trips this summer?
What's the latest on the cost of living? Google helps you find the facts. Our products are designed to prioritize quality information so you can find news you can trust. Learn how Google supports news in Canada at g.co/news in Canada.
Freedom, I don't think anybody's ever run on this platform in Canada before. I've never really heard it as a political construct in Canada before. It feels like a very direct response to the COVID restrictions and lockdowns. And if so, it's pretty limited and time limited, I would think, in terms of its potency. But am I missing something again there? Is it a broader appeal? Is it a broader construct for Poilievre voters than I think it is? What does it mean?
Well, I think right now what it's doing is it is bridging anti-vaxxers to the right of the Conservative Party. So it is talking about a value that Conservative voters think they're about, which is get the government off my back and, get out of my wallet and let me do whatever I want, which has got broad appeal in that constituency, and specifically to the 10 to 15% of Canadians who have bought anti-vax fables. And so that is a potent combination in the Conservative Party. We saw this play out in Alberta with Mr. Kenney getting the heave-ho, right? Because although I think it is a majority in Canada, it's maybe half or more of the Conservative Party. And so it's a very, very smart, canny appeal to the votes that you need to be elected as leader of that party. And what remains to be seen is whether it has any legs to the broader population. I think that there's 30 to 35% of the vote out there that is there for them. And I think they can stretch that a little bit if they're not opposed. But like you, I'm not sure that this is going to have the legs that it has now if the election is two years from now. So some of this depends on whether the current parliament remains in office, and therefore some of it turns on whether the Liberals and the Democrats can keep working together. And if that happens, then I think Mr. Poilievre is going to need to come up with something else.
Right. Brian, we can't really talk about this without talking about the prairie provinces, where Poilievre has so many members and raised so much money. And let's just take my home province of Saskatchewan that you know very well because you worked intricately with the Romanow government, extended to Lorne Calvert, but the last time the NDP were in office in Saskatchewan. And ever since then, it seemed remote to impossible that they would get back into office in Saskatchewan. So what is why is Saskatchewan such fertile ground for this Poilievre campaign, and why has Saskatchewan become such a right-wing conservative place?
That is a very good question. Let's begin by saying, I'm not. The prairies, as you know,
when I lived there, they were the default. The NDP were the default government, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I think the prairies are a more complicated place than the color on the election map and Tory fundraising results would suggest. So let's just start with Alberta. In the darkest days of the dumbest conservative government there, which is saying a lot, 40 to 45% of the Alberta public consistently voted for progressive parties, either the Alberta Liberal Party or the Alberta Democrat Party. And they could never go over the top and win until Rachel Notley came along. But that's a pretty big chunk of the population that is consistently saying this is not us, that climate change is caused by dinosaurs, which is what their premier asserted for a while, isn't what we think. Okay, and I think that's also true in Manitoba, and that's true in Saskatchewan. So the relative success the Conservatives have masks that there's a more complicated places, and that there's a pretty big progressive vote on the prairies in all three provinces. Now, with regard to Saskatchewan, this is a complicated story. Part of it is what I was saying earlier, which is at a certain point, the public just gets bored of you when you've been in office a lot. The Democrats had a good long run in office, 4 majority terms. One needed a little help, and the public was just sick and tired of them and wanted to send them off to go rethink themselves and wanted to try something new. And they had in Premier Wall a very able populist, which is why I respect right-wing populists, and I think that they're dangerous. And I think you need to take them on and understand their appeal. And for quite a while, he put on a great show.
He had an ability to sound moderate, though. I mean, for a long time, my friends in Saskatchewan liked Brad Wall. That changed toward the end, but yeah.
Well, it's because they learned the lesson of divine government. I think they were. Look, I know a bunch of the people in that party. I have a lot of Reg Downs and other people like that. They're smart. You know what they did? When they got clobbered, they thought about it, and then they changed what they were doing.
Right.
And what they told themselves is the people of Saskatchewan don't want a over-the-top, crazy, neo-separatist government that is wrecking everything and that is on the take. And so they changed their name to get people to forget their history. And then they did govern much more incrementally and cautiously because they had learned the lesson that that's what the public wanted, which is my point about how the province isn't as conservative as it looks.
But this Mo guy is not Wall.
He's not Wall. And they are long in the tooth, long in office. And so they are vulnerable. But if they're the only party on the ice, then they'll keep winning. And so the official opposition has a heavy duty to think about what it has been doing that doesn't work and to make a better offer. And that's exactly what they're doing. They just elected a new leader in Saskatchewan, Herle Burly-ites. She is we're from a farm background, worked on the education file. She is very relatable and young and energetic and fun. And maybe she can pull it off. We'll see. And certainly I think.
But those rural ridings are brutal. I mean, you're talking about. There has been, like the NDP are competitive in the cities and in a good election could win the cities. I get that. So there's lots of people in Saskatchewan who aren't dyed-in-the-wool conservatives. But there aren't many rural Saskatchewanians who are not dyed-in-the-wool conservatives
until they stop being that way. So
okay.
In 2015, I have a friend who went into an old rattle-down cafe near Medicine Hat in southeast Alberta. And you know what's in that cafe? Real cowboys, not pretend cowboys, real cowboys who actually deal with cows. And they all
know how to fill their truck up with gas?
That kind of thing. Yeah. You can get the noise and the hat doesn't have the price tag still on it, that kind of thing that we get from Mr. Kenny and his friends. So they were in that cafe. My friend was listening, right? They were talking about the election. And they were saying, geez, the Conservatives have made a hash of things. It's a clown show. And I said, yeah. And they were going, what are we going to do? So one of them said, maybe this time we should vote for that nice NDP lady. And they all went, yeah, that's a good idea. Let's give her a shot and see how she can do. Now, you know what? They didn't know her name. Okay, they didn't know her name. That was how new the whole offer was to her. But there was something about what Rachel Notley was offering that election that made that rural ranching riding that is as hard rock blue as you are suggesting Saskatchewan is, and they did otherwise. And another group of people, my relatives in Trois-Rivières in Quebec, which was Maurice Duplessis' seat, okay, the heart of the Quebec nationalist bleu, clerical world. My relatives were solid bleus for the most part. And they all got together in 2011 and they said, what are we going to do in this election? We're going to keep sending some guy to sit in the opposition benches and do nothing. And it's like, why don't we try that Layton guy and see if he's okay, right? And so the NDP swept Trois-Rivières, a solid bleu Duplessis history riding. So all this to say, I don't buy statements that people can't change their minds and try something else, but you have to earn it. And in the rural prairies, which has a radical tradition as well as a conservative one, they're looking for a better offer, and they haven't heard it yet. And that's on us, okay, to provide it. But I don't believe it can't be done. I know it can be done.
What do you think would if I dropped you into Swift Current, Saskatchewan, and asked you to convince people in a coffee shop or in Wong's Cafe to vote NDP, what would you say?
Well, the first thing that I would do is leave. And then I would send in a local city councillor, somebody who's a successful farm operator who's in their 30s and 40s, something like that. Somebody whose family has been in the area for since pioneering days. And I think she would talk to those folks on Coffee Row that you're talking about in Swift Current there. And she'd say, we've been governed for going into 4 terms now by a government that doesn't know what it's doing, by a weak premier that doesn't reflect our values, that thinks that it can stay in office by making us angry at each other and by trying to pretend we're the Parti Québécois and picking fights with Ottawa. And you know what? We have real work to do here in the province instead. And then make an offer that speaks to people's pocketbook issues, that's about their concern for inflation. Housing prices are still not so bad in Saskatchewan, so you probably don't have to talk about that. But people are still concerned that all their kids have to go to Calgary to have a better future. And so you need to talk about that, about hope for the future and a diversified value-added economy in Saskatchewan, and find some way to talk about that does not cause people to become unconscious, and talk to them about their healthcare services and about doing better schools so their kids have the tools that they need. And then we're going to look after our seniors in decent long-term care instead of a disgrace and a blot on the province. And then maybe you'll make some progress, because you know what? People in Swift Current, just like people in downtown Saskatoon, care about that. And it's not what they're getting from their provincial government. And if you've got the right leader, right connection, talk about it right, make the record of the government stick to them for once, then maybe you got a shot. And then maybe you'll get that takeoff.
Hey, the hospitals all over rural Saskatchewan are a mess. Do you think the Sask Party is in the process of ending the curse that was put on the Saskatchewan NDP by the closure of rural hospitals?
It's an interesting issue, that one. The Saskatchewan NDP caucus put out some very funny stuff about that. And what they did was they just ran photos of themselves when that policy was implemented, and they were all school children.
Right.
Okay. They were all like 8, 9 years old and stuff like that. It's a very, very canny piece of campaigning by the Sask Party, and it's a terrible strategic mistakes by a campaign team in the NDP to allow that debate to go where it did. Other than 1 or 2 exceptions, none of the rural facilities that you're talking about were actually closed. They were converted to
I do not care what you say. I do not care what documentary sources you cite. Romanow closed 52 rural hospitals. I know this for a fact because it is the conventional wisdom.
I know. And it was created by many millions of dollars of unanswered attack ads from money that was raised in Calgary. So it's, this issue of rural health care is going to have to be dealt with by the official opposition if they want to be the government. They have a job to do to talk about the record. And one of them was reopened by the current government and all the time that they were in office as a hospital. And then let's talk about now. Let's talk about where things have been under this government and what kind of care you're getting from this government. And if healthcare is the key issue, according to the government, then let's debate it. And let's see what their record looks like in terms of what they did compared to the alternative that you can put forward. So then we'll see how it plays out. But what you can't do, and this is back to my point, you can't win a hockey game if you don't get on the ice. And when you tell yourself in 4 campaigns, we're not going to debate the issues that the opponent's facing, right? Nobody believes this stuff, right? This was litigated in the 1995 provincial election. The government was reelected with the majority. This is over. We're not going to talk about this. Then you get what you see here, which is in the cradle of Medicare, that at least rural Saskatchewanians believe that healthcare is better in the hands of the Conservatives who opposed it. And that's a pretty neat trick to pull off. And it's back to my point about how you have to stop telling yourself, oh, we did as best as we could. Like, at least we avoided, being clobbered. And we're so proud of ourselves. That's not good enough. Right? The public needs, especially when the official opposition, is to run for office. And if you don't succeed, then you need to ask yourself why and fix what you did and do better. And I think the Saskatchewan NDP has told itself that. As I say, they just went through a really big post-mortem exercise. And I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that the current government in Saskatchewan has been there long enough that it is ripe for defeat.
You talking about postmortems? I don't know if I was supposed to read it or not. I can't remember whether it was confidential and leaked somehow. But your postmortem on the Adrian Dix loss in British Columbia is one of the great analyses of an election campaign I've ever read.
That's too for saying so. I'm looking forward to yours on Ontario.
Yeah, no, I just flagellate myself. I have no excuses. Listen, this has been tremendous. I know that everybody out there will have learned a tremendous amount from you today. And by God, I hope if I am ever running for office that you are on my side, my friend, because you are good at this business. Thank you for doing it.
It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah. Great talking to you. I would like to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsors, CN and Google. I would like to thank all you Herle Burly-ites for listening. We'll have more next week. But boy, Brian Topp, what a treat. Till next week. See you.